Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I would like to welcome you to the second keynote of the annual conference of the nccr on the Move. And I'm very glad that Greg Feldman... Does that work, no? Do I have to shout? No. Oh, no, this is better, no? That Greg Feldman has accepted the invitation to come here. I think he has written one of the most interesting books on migration policy in the European Union, with my migration apparatus, where he, from an anthropological perspective, tried to understand how migration policy, technologies, and also subjectivities in the bureaucracy come together in trying to manage migration and asylum and people on the move. And it's very important for us in the nccr on the Move to have this kind of theoretical but also ethnographic account of how, like, the bigger picture in migration management is working, to understand how Switzerland, and in Switzerland, migration is understood. So Gregory Feldman is a socio-cultural anthropologist, at the moment based at the School for International Studies at Fraser University. And his current research is like looking at security officials at the southern border of Europe to understand like trafficking and illegal migration. And he's especially interested in the ethics of the people doing this kind of work. And besides the ethnographic research, he's also thinking philosophically and on a normative level to understand what does it mean to be in a society which is so much structured by migration, in the sense of what does it mean for people who are on the move but who are not on the move to be in a mass society, and also to have to be atomized in these very specific systems of technocracy, bureaucracy, and individualism. So it's the question of like where to go in this society is really important, and I'm very glad that you're here. And the floor is yours with the talk on the structure of ethical dilemmas among policymakers and security officials in contemporary European migration management.
Well, again, I'd like to thank you all for having me, and of course, Rohit Jain for the invitation, and Gina Fiore for making it logistically possible. And I've understood that a top priority for this conference is understanding the changing shape of migration management in Europe, so that the nccr program can better think about Switzerland's role in it. I'll try to do the former, and I hope that helps you do the latter. Specifically, I'm going to try to make two contributions, each in their own way. And the first, rather than describe how EU migration management, for lack of a better term, how it looks different in 2016 than, say, the late 1990s when it gets started, I'll instead describe what I think the modus operandi is for migration management by the term that I'll call the migration apparatus. And I think this shows the logics that enable different forms of migration management as they change through time and respond to different crises. And of course, there's lots of those going around. The second thing I'll try to do here is, rather than rise to the bait and answer the question, so what do I think Europe should do about migration? Instead, I'm going to point the question in the other direction. And I want to examine the question of what prevents a migration policy official from doing what they think is the right thing to do. And I apply the term migration policy official to anyone from border control officers to migration policy academics to commissioners and EC directorates general. I have a broad definition of a policy player. No one with any policy authority actually listens to me. My politics are on the left, and I use critical theory, so this is, doesn't go very far outside the university. But people do listen to people who have policy authority. So I think it is crucial to ask them, do you agree with what you are doing? And if not, what precludes you from doing what you think should be done? So I'm going to turn the question in the other direction, and not in an antagonistic way either. I just think it's a fundamental question we all need to ask. Okay, so here's how I'm going to get at this. This talk is going to address the issue this way. How is it possible, on the one hand, for thousands of people working in different policy capacities to be powerless as individuals, but on the other hand, to hold collectively tremendous leverage over literally millions of migrants? They're neither unified as a political party nor part of a political movement. People are just working. In a weird way, we have a situation in which the powerless but enfranchised control or condition the powerless but disenfranchised. No one holds power per se, it seems, even if a minority has leverage over a very large majority. So how do we get here? Okay, so after briefly explaining the apparatus as a concept, I'm going to address this question in 4 steps. First, I want to illustrate how an apparatus operates through the example of a migrant's journey from Senegal to Italy. Second, I want to explain the technical means through which an apparatus proliferates. How does it expand, goes farther and farther? Third, to examine then how it eliminates its technicians' capacity to act on their own ethical judgments. And then fourth, I want to conclude at a general level of how an apparatus isolates people with the effect of rendering them both productive but politically docile. So it's going to be concept, operation, proliferation, elimination, and isolation. Those are the steps. All right. Now, to situate policymakers, technocrats, border officials, etc., I want to put them into a form of social relations in which they work. And I don't call it a bureaucracy, because that term to me somehow does not capture the dynamism and ubiquity of what's going on. It's too lethargic, it's too geographically contained. Similarly, a regime, which I know political scientists use this term a lot, a regime to me sounds a little too rigid and a little too authoritarian. The director issues commands and others must follow. This is not postmodern enough, I don't think. There's the term infrastructure, which is now widely used in critical studies of power, but its analytical domain, I think, is too comprehensive to be useful, and it plays a little bit too much with Bruno Latour for me. The term I like is apparatus, because it specifies how vast numbers of people become integrated in an array of sovereign practices that, if effective, achieves no more than economic growth and social equilibrium, as if that's all we're put here on earth to do. And the concept I'm developing based on the work of Michel Foucault and Paul Rabinow at Berkeley. Now, an apparatus functions as a device of population control and economic management, composed of disparate elements that coalesce around objects identified as threats, quote unquote, in moments understood to be security crises. What are these elements? Well, according to Foucault, they are resolutely heterogeneous, incorporating discourses, institutions, architectural arrangements, policy decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, moral and philosophical propositions, end quote. In sum, these are the elements of an apparatus, but specifically, he sees an apparatus as the network that pulls those elements together. As Paul Rabinow puts it, quote, the apparatus embodies a kind of strategic bricolage that functions to define and to regulate targets constituted through a mixed economy of power and knowledge. And the knowledge part's important because it's expert authority which gives someone leverage in an apparatus. It's not the person, it's the authority that you're recognized to hold. Lacking, however, a central authority, it is rather instantiated in different places and different moments, when a passive, and I emphasize the word passive technician, deploys its operational logics. That is, when the said threat signals that crisis we were talking about. Its coherence, therefore, is obtained in a de facto manner, and it appears only when the threatening object, quote unquote, calls it reluctantly into existence, like a pop-up doll that sort of springs to life when the button is pushed. The apparatus's targets, however, probably understand this synergistic force better than those who operate it. Okay, so because of that, the next thing I want to show is how this apparatus operates from the perspective of a migration journey that someone undertook. This journey is based on someone named Billy who narrated the story himself. It's his story. I fictionalized one part of it just to better convey how the migration apparatus would have monitored his journey. And I have to do it this way because you can't both be with the person and all the various other policy players doing their different parts. You can't be in multiple locations at once. So I have to present it to you in this format. This migration journey starts with a devastating blow to the Senegalese fishing industry, resulting from 17 agreements with the European Union. These agreements allowed EU trawlers to fish in Senegalese waters while setting tight quotas on Senegalese fish exports back to EU markets. The 2002 to 2006 agreement guaranteed Senegal 15 million euro for annual compensation for their loss in market share. But the resulting protest suggested that this figure was too little too late. The new economic difficulties led to increased unemployment and increased attempts at illegal entries into the EU. One of those taking the chance was a 45-year-old nurse named Mamadou Diallo from the Senegalese capital of Dakar. He lost most of his clientele and so his income. Billy, as he goes by, calculated that his monthly salary of $130 could not support his wife and his children. Making the journey overland to Europe was both cheaper than flying, and according to the rumor he heard, it required no visa. He thought he would reach Spain in a week. Billy later reflected, quote, "Little did I know how wrong that was." Billy left Dakar paying a man $1,300 to deliver him to Europe, which began with a three-legged journey via rail, plane, and truck to Goa, Mali. And it's here where he met thousands of other migrants congregated to arrange transport across the Sahara Desert to the Mediterranean. This has changed. This is prior to the Islamic insurgency that the French got involved in a few years ago. This is before then. We're talking about 2009 or so. Here, thousands of migrants had congregated, and up until that point, Gaul was a major staging point to begin the journey northward. People would hire Tuareg guides to take them across. Billy first appeared on the EU's radar screen here, but more specifically, he appeared as a statistical estimate of West Africans entering Mali on something called the IMAP, or the Interactive Web-Based Migration Map, which looks like this. This is actually online. The public part of it, anyway. The EU, Middle Eastern, and African countries participate in the IMAP by sharing information on it. It stores a wide range of information, including migration statistics, detention policies, migration-related laws, migration-related development programs, border security policies, etc. A Malayan bureaucrat, probably working in CIGIM, which is a French acronym for a migration information center that's in Goa, where migrants are supposed to learn about the legal ways to emigrate. A Malayan bureaucrat working there probably uploaded the information about an influx of West Africans into his country. From there, a diligent analyst based in Frontex headquarters in Warsaw, they have the 24th and the 25th stories here, not the whole building. They're not that powerful, right? Okay. The analyst at the headquarters here reported to senior officials what the IMAP had told him. Those officials, in turn, requested that the European Space Agency refocus their satellites over Northwest Africa. And they had little problem acquiring the technological capacity to do so. The Cold War infrastructure, so valuable in tracking Soviet armament, now required a new object of security lest it all rusts, to say nothing of the business interests. And from the operator's standpoint, the change is easy enough. One former US defense official, who's now an industry consultant, explained to me, he says, quote, "If you take it from a system perspective, it's all the same thing. The tracking doesn't matter if it's a migrant, a MiG, or a terrorist," end quote. As such, Frontex would be prepared to track Billy throughout his journey and rapidly respond once he launched himself into the Mediterranean Sea. But back to Billy. An arduous month-long journey across Algeria and Morocco's Atlas Mountains, Billy and his fellow travelers reached Tangiers. At this point, they boarded 3 small motorized boats. They laid down on the floorboards to avoid the searchlights, except for the fairest-skinned among them whom they needed to steer the boats. Billy and his colleagues entered what might be called an aquatic limes, L-I-M-E-S. I don't know if it's pronounced limes or limes. Anyway, limes, like limes. The term limes derives from an ancient Roman concept of a border zone, loosely identified by amorphous natural features like a marsh, a bog, or a forest, which is then strictly demarcated by rock fortifications. These are the Roman walls. The Roman Empire used these fortifications to repel invading Germanic barbarians from the north and hostile tribes from the east. In the modern EU, LIMES, L-I-M-E-S, and the ad wizards obviously didn't advise them on this, LIMES is an acronym that stands for Land and Sea Integrated Monitoring for European Security, a program designed to tighten that amorphous border known as the Mediterranean Sea. So the EU empire is now directly analogous to the Roman Empire by their own phrasing here. The European Maritime Security Services, or MERIS, this is a division of the European Space Agency, would take over the project from here. And here's how MERIS sees migration. It boasts that it can, quote, spot infrastructure and changes related to illegal trafficking, such as boat building facilities, new mustering and embarkation facilities, storage facilities, or the buildup of people in sensitive areas close to the coast or national borders. So any unusual congregation of people kicks off in the radar system and a red flag goes up that there's something different happening here we need to watch. Okay, satellites then can sort of track how people congregate and move. Of the 3 boats that I mentioned, the first drifted out of sight, never to be heard of again. The remaining 2 kept due course for the Spanish exclave of Ceuta. While Maris operators found their direction suspicious, their movements resembled those of local fishing boats. As such, they opted not to call in the Spanish patrol boats, as the uncertainty could justify the cost of the deployment. An hour later, however, one of the 2 boats remaining lost motor power, and it caused it to sputter in a zigzag pattern, a clear deviation from normal boating patterns as confirmed by data from the Spanish Fisheries Service. As the patrol boats moved closer towards the deviant vessels, Billy's boat continued to Ceuta. When the patrol boat came for them, they decided to jump into the sea, knowing that if their rescue occurred in national waters, they could claim asylum in Spain. And it worked. Billy's claim was surprisingly successful, but probably because he said he was from Rwanda, not Senegal. In Spain, Billy worked in the fields for a month to earn enough money to travel to Brescia, Italy. When he finally arrived in the Italian town, he was supposed to meet a cousin, but never found him. He ended up living for a year with 15 other migrants in the filthy crawl space of a one-room flat. Billy sold African trinkets and jewelry to make a living. Eventually, a friend gave him a biometric work permit, and he got a factory job making agricultural tools. Now he could finally send remittances back to his family. And which he did for 4 years, until Italian police inspected the company's premises on suspicion that they had been employing illegal migrants. Billy's work permit was run through the visa information system. And while his face superficially resembles his friend's on the permit, the match was not close enough to defeat the algorithm. In other words, a mathematical formula determined that the measurement, for example, between the tip of Billy's nose and the center of his chin deviated with statistical significance from the same measurement stored in the document's radio frequency identification chip. This deviation suggested to police that the work permit did not belong to Billy. So while his body did actual work for the Italian economy, the virtual information about his body was deemed sufficiently abnormal to locate him outside the realm of legality. One biometric consultant succinctly captured the irony of this situation. He noted that biometrics has, quote, shifted the emphasis from habeas corpus to habeas cognos, from show me the body in a court of law to do you have information about some body that might exist. Your existence, he continues, was proved because you had a body, but today you only exist if you have information about that body, end quote. Billy was transferred to detention center to wait return to Senegal. After 45 days, he was flown back on a chartered jet with other Senegalese who were detained in Italy, France, and Germany. And I'm picking on Lufthansa a little bit unfairly. But when Frontex first started a program of return, they chartered the national champions of major EU companies that would then basically charter flights of migrants that had to be returned back to their countries, except it's bad advertising. So the major champions like Lufthansa and Air France got out of this business, and now it's Air Romania and Air Balkans and the ones that, you know, wealthy people try not to fly on. I know that sounds terrible, but okay. So he's taken then all the way back to Senegal. Yet Billy's journey, along with hundreds of thousands of other migrants in similar circumstances, is written off through a routinely uttered ethical narrative. Speaking at a biometric industry convention for corporate executives and government officials, there was no migrants there that I could detect anyway, I was at this thing too, Dr. Frank Paul, head of the European Commission's unit on large-scale IT systems, articulated that narrative as effectively as anyone, and is worthy of a lengthy quote. He's speaking in 2009, by the way. You've all seen these, this is Frank Paul, you've all seen those terrible pictures of people drowning in the Mediterranean trying to reach Lampedusa, and then in the Atlantic as well, or perhaps the Canary Islands. These are absolute tragedies. We have to do everything to stop it. And one of the ideas is the need to develop a very sophisticated maritime surveillance system that will allow us not only to detect those movements as early as possible, but also before people actually, and then he stutters, before they actually get to the Mediterranean, to have more intelligence on their whereabouts. Today as we speak, there are an estimated 250,000 people, 250,000 in Libya, who are basically just hanging out and waiting to go to Europe. And we know more or less about their whereabouts, but we'd like to have more information, more intelligence about what exactly they're planning, when they're planning to go to Europe, how do they do this, when do they embark. And by doing that and having this information, we would be able to intervene much earlier. And then not only with the idea of building an absolute fortress around Europe, because this is not our intention, but it is simply to save lives and make sure that these people don't drown and direct them to the legal ways of emigrating, end quote. Now, Paul's deployment of this narrative shows us how the inclusion of migrants as a part of humanity, we should save people, is undercut by excluding them with tight immigration quotas. In the form of the EU, the state thus casts itself on the immigrant's side by patronizingly claiming to save them from their own bad choices, while bearing no responsibility for the structural factors that marginalize them in the first place. Okay, now, through what kind of space did Billy migrate? His journey was largely shaped by a representation of space, and I get this idea from Lefebvre, the Marxist geographer, maybe some of the geographers have read. This is the orderly space of public administration and corporate planning, the ideal form that goes into policy, basically. And while that space often differs radically from how people actually live their lives on the street, so to speak, representations of space significantly condition praxis. That is how people negotiate these realities. How does it work? No one dictated Billy's actions per se. Instead, an array of police officers, satellite operators, sea captains, and other technicians simply responded to his own creative choices. And they responded according to the logics that they are paid to deploy in specific situations. Their specific actions materialized an apparatus that interacted with Billy as he traveled from south to north. He signaled his presence to it whenever he deviated from one norm or another. It then narrowed down his choices for safe movement. It didn't say stop, it just said we're going to make this hard for you. It forced him to climb ever further out onto a limb, and caught up with him finally in northern Italy. As he sought economic security, it edged him out of narrowly defined legal spaces and into vast, ill-defined geographic spaces like deserts and sea, where he could have perished unknown to anyone else. The point of contact between the Billy and the Italian police officers who caught him was essentially a disembodied encounter, indirectly mediated by the biometric information that they exchanged. Billy lost a significant amount of income to remit to his family, but as they say, it was nothing personal. Quite literally, the police meant nothing personally by royally screwing up his life. Okay. Now, if Billy's journey illustrates the apparatus from the perspective of someone who must negotiate it, then what does it look like on the inside? Let's not take the easy path when answering this question. I'm going to avoid the large-scale, sensational, big-ticket items like Schengen Information System and the Visa Information System, and most spectacularly Frontex, because lots of other things have to happen before you get to Frontex. These examples tempt us too literally to think in Orwellian totalitarian terms, yet apparatuses are the products of liberal humanitarianism. They motivate their technicians not through state terror or hatred of inferior races or decadent classes, but rather through the thrill of teamwork and altruism. They aim not to eliminate, but to save. To illustrate, I turn to two utterly mundane initiatives that enable the proliferation of an apparatus, in this case, a migration apparatus. And these boring examples show us the banality through which diverse people come to act in homogenized ways, even if they do so creatively. As both Hannah Arendt and Michel Foucault have insisted, modern power achieves its pervasive effects at the level of the ordinary, not the spectacular. Okay, so let me give a couple of examples of what I mean. Under the Immigration and Integration Unit of the EC's Directorate General Migration and Home Affairs, the European Migration Network assumed the task of creating an asylum and migration glossary. A former physicist turned European Commission desk officer coordinates the network, composed of representatives from each participating member state known as national contact points. They meet monthly to discuss migration-related research projects aimed at developing comparative perspectives on key migration issues, and also to develop a common reservoir of knowledge from which the EU can make collective policy decisions. They meet in a very unappealing Brussels building in rooms ringed with translators' booths. They decide what studies should be done, which member states can and should conduct them, and then they return home to commission PhDs and doctoral students to do the work. The problem immediately arose that each member state applies different shades of meaning to different policy terms. Hence, the EMN created a working group to meet every 8 weeks for 4 years to sort out the raft of terminology at play in migration policy discussions. And their work resulted in the Asylum and Migration Glossary, subtitled A Tool for Better Comparability. This is the title, cover page. Most of the terms are derived from usages in already existing documents authored by the EC and other international organizations. The online version of the glossary provides the reader with hyperlinks to connect to a different document from which the term originates. For example, the term resident documents comes from Council Regulation 343/2003, in case you wanted to know. The term countries of transit comes from the IOM's, International Organization for Migration. It comes from their own glossary on migration. You can follow the link to that one too. Thus, the reader can see how migration policy vocabulary exists in a vast field of self-referencing legal and policy documents. The result is a linguistic colossus that homogenizes diverse national languages into a transcendental idiom of policy speak. That colossus of power knowledge remains far removed from the lived world of actual migrations that it comes to define. As for verbal communication, also for visual communication. Here, a rising migration policy star with postgraduate education in law and business crime leads a small but industrious young team in a well-known migration international organization. For 10 years, this team has been organizing policy workshops for migration officials from Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East that facilitate dialogue among them on migration issues. And they're the ones who originally developed the IMAP that I showed you before. Here it is again. So basically, this is a clearinghouse of migration information in order to facilitate information exchange among these diversity of officials, all hailing from different countries. And the migration policy star that I mentioned explained to me, he says the IMAP, quote, provides you with the latest figures of apprehension, smuggling networks, etc. It can provide briefing notes. If countries use the IMAP for policy positions, then this helps in creating agreements between countries. It will probably bring the position of these countries much closer. It's a tool at the service of the state. We are here to sell the service, end quote. Europol and Frontex are co-sponsors of those workshops I mentioned, along with UNHCR, plus many other governments, including the Swiss government. Casting the networks even further, Interpol, UNODC, and the Odysseus Academic Network, I'm sure you all know what this is, specifically participate on the IMAP to check the accuracy of the information uploaded. Now the IMAP, what you see here, it shows you migration routes such as the Central Mediterranean route, the West African route, etc. It color codes them according to their clandestine function. Black lines for land routes, white for sea routes, yellow for marine and air routes. The viewer enjoys a God's eye view of the African landmass in the expanses of the Mediterranean Sea and gains a sense of mastery over clandestine movements. One Frontex official called it the crystal ball. The people and the countries they traverse become knowable and thus manageable. They are neatly packaged in easy to understand graphic form with bite-sized pieces of information about where migrants are going, the methods they use to travel, and everything that Frank Paul was asking for. Tools like the IMAP encourage officials who rarely engage each other directly, because they're spread out all over countries, but to literally see the world through the same lens. These are the literal effects of a metaphorical picture of so-called illegal migration flows. This standardization makes it simpler for the EU to make deals with Arabic states, because both sides now speak the same policy language, to put it colloquially. So tools like the Asylum and Migration Glossary and the IMAP create the possibility of policy integration among dozens of countries, scores of ministries, and thousands of unconnected policy and security officials. And these tools do not just build edifices. They enable an unlimited range of local initiatives to contribute to the ever-growing proliferation of surveillance in the migration apparatus. Okay, so if that's proliferation, then let's talk about the human element and what I think of as elimination of action. Now, if the glossary and the IMAP technically proliferate things, what about that elusive human element? Let me briefly mention two modes through which human agency, a term that I said I don't use yesterday, but I just used it, is rendered both politically docile and professionally productive at the same time, right? First I'll mention is what Joe Haven calls high-scale morality. And this refers to the rationales and justifications that policymakers, technocrats, analysts, speechwriters, public officials, politicians, and so many others deploy on a regular basis. It expresses sentiments and ideas applied to large numbers of people in order to establish a coherence among them, as they are otherwise unrelated in vast geographic spaces. Here they obtain a tremendous organizing power because they are general without being vague and familiar enough to pass as common sense, and they dominate the field of communication through sheer volume and repetition. And the examples I have in mind are phrases like save migrants who are unaware from the legal ways of immigration, or what you used to hear a few years ago is a migration policy that works for everybody. Or in the cases of circular migration, as was mentioned just yesterday, the win-win-win situation. So circular migration is a win for the receiving country, a win for the sending country, and a win for the migrant themselves that does the circulating. And the more you hear these, it's not just that you agree with them, is that no one else can get a word in edgewise because you hear them all the time, and they command the communication field. Okay, if that's one, another then is an additional human dimension is in the form of the nonce bureaucrat. This individual experiences a sense of fulfillment when collaborating with others who share a unique skill that provides a crucial service to the larger mission. The anthropologist Don Brennis describes it subtly and accurately as, quote, a considerable social pleasure of a type defined in professional self-definition and satisfaction, along with the enjoyment of the technique that one commands, end quote. Border control officers are a good example of nonce bureaucrats, as they now regularly cooperate in informal ways. As one Dutch border official explained, quote, if we need information from Spain, if you go through the official route for getting that information, it takes too long. But if you know someone personally, then it comes in minutes. I just send an email, and you'd be amazed at how much secure information goes over email. End quote. Anyway, it's true. Now, this gentleman, a veteran of Frontex operations, expresses in 2010 a very prescient opinion that was shared among his colleagues when he said, quote, for one thing, this is about solidarity. We're still talking about nonce bureaucrats. It's about solidarity. Even in meetings, you can feel the gratitude from other member states for your participation. It means your national training is working. We can say we've intercepted the most people, that we're doing a good job. The chain is only strong as the weakest link. It's a whole in all of Europe. If we train them, then local border guards take pride in their work. Soon we will have European border guards. You can feel it going in that direction. It used to be short-term deployment for 2 or 3 months. If that works, then it will be 6 months. And then we're going to have a European border guard, end quote. And he's just about right, because ever since the Syrian crisis, about midway through the Syrian crisis, the European Parliament has begun talks on actually creating a standalone European border guard, not just Frontex. Frontex actually has a hard time getting things to work because they have to get so many different countries to participate. Okay. And how does this apparatus affect its technicians? At least those capable, or willing, I should say, of answering their own doubts about what they're doing in the real world. After ethnographically studying for over 15 years various diplomats and policymakers and officials involved in minority and immigrant issues in Europe, I've come to take a stock phrase quite seriously. And I'm sure many of you have heard this before too, that interviews with policy players often begin with them asking me, do you want to know what I think, or do you want to know what I have to tell you? Right? I get this all the time. And my reply is always both. Tell me everything. But their opening salvo, at least in some cases, is more than just rhetoric. Rather, it points to a disjuncture between their own ethical concerns and what the job of migration management is asking them to do. It asks that they treat people as categories, to be cold and distant rather than actual people. Now, in the immediate moment, the rationale for treating people coldly actually makes good sense. The official cannot be fair to all if you're privileging one person in particular. But at the same time, this just doesn't quite work. Take Maria, for example. She works in the Interior Ministry of the Non-Residence Nationals Unit of a European Union member state. She is responsible for processing the paperwork of refugee applicants awaiting decisions on their fates. Equipped with a master's degree in European studies, previous administrative experience, and a diligent work ethic, she seems well suited for the job. However, a visit to a government holding center complicated the indifference that her job demanded. She explained, quote, "At work, they are just statistics. They aren't real people. I get them on a piece of paper, just files and files and files. I want to hear it from them. They can tell me if they have a mother and a father or had to fight in a civil war. Somalis, for example, they've been through a lot. I thought, here's something I could do in my spare time. So I began teaching English in the center 4 times a week. The atmosphere was good. I became their friend. They gave me a birthday party, and they put candles in Coke bottles and sang me songs. The first lesson that I taught, the topic was family. But when they started talking about the deaths and the killings, it started from there. I had to reorganize the lessons. I tried money, holidays, or dreams. Speaking to kids, their big dreams is to have money to send back to their families so they can get back together." End quote. Maria's disposition towards these migrants distinguished her from her co-workers, who explained that she faced a conflict of interest. How could she address these migrants' personal needs while still honoring her professional duty to the state? One cannot be loyal to a state and a person of their own choosing at the same time. Or take Ricardo. He is an undercover police investigator whose boss put him on an urgent case involving a possible terrorist. And this is going to be an extended quote as well, because the story is so, it makes an impression. Here's the story. He says, "A plane from Tunisia. There was a fake trip of entrepreneurs coming to our country. After the first day, they were gone. This was a little bit after the bombings in Spain and at the height of the war on terror. My boss got me up in the middle of the night to look in every hotel and motel for them. We got some of them. My boss later told me that one had been seen inside a government office with a rucksack. Please go and get him," he said. I went with my colleague and we arrested him. I took him to our regional department and they were going to expel him from the country. I had established a little rapport with him when I arrested him because I speak a little bit of Arabic and I didn't use the handcuffs. Several months later, a guy calls my name out in the street, and it's the same guy. He had not been expelled, and he was not in a holding center because they were full. He says to me, "Ricardo, you have to help me because I'm running from the police." He didn't realize that I was the police when I arrested him because I didn't use the cuffs, and I talked to him in his own language. He just thought I was taking him to immigration. That was it. So what's the situation? First, I have a guy who is a risk nationality. Second, a guy who's made my boss frantic. Third, a guy who's running from the police. What can I do? I asked him what happened. He says, "They want to expel me." I told him I have to make a phone call, and just to wait a second. So I phoned my boss, and I said, "I've got one of the Tunisian guys. What do I do?" Boss says, "Stall him. We're coming." The guy starts to get anxious, and I said, "Hey, if I get you a job in the north of the country, is that okay?" He says, "Yes." Well, that's what he wants. Of course he said yes. The poor thing looked relieved and alleviated. So we stay there waiting for my guys to come. He asked me twice, "Ricardo, is this a serious thing? Because I'm trusting you." I assure him that everything is going to be all right. When the guys arrive, they arrest him. During the trip, he runs away at an intersection at a red light. He realized it was a trick. I catch him and I hold him down on the street. He's screaming, I trusted you, you betrayed me." At the department, he's screaming that if they deport me to Tunisia, they're going to kill me. You don't know if they really will kill him, but you can see the shot. Basically, a good deal of contact in these investigations is deceiving the other part. Not in a legal way, but in a streetwise way. When he heard that he would be deported, he turned white and he screamed and he vomited up a black mess. His last words to me were, "In my village, I'm going to buy a lamb, I'm going to give it your name, and I'm going to cut its throat." That was a landmark in an emotional way. I felt like I betrayed it. I stayed awake for a couple of nights. My colleagues teased me about it. They recognized it as a clever thing to do, but that makes it hurt even more. You can't show the guys at work because you have to be tough. Maybe they also hurt with the cases, but we don't talk about it. Now, it's easy to be cynical with these examples and conclude that we have two people who are simply absolving themselves from their responsibility in administrative and physical violence. But please keep an open mind. Ricardo and Maria thought and acted against the grain. Well, Ricardo wanted to, but he didn't. People are rendered politically they did this and they were isolated from it, or they risked isolation, right? Both of them had to think about that. And people are rendered politically neutral through isolation. And this is the last part I want to talk about. Recall that the opening question of the talk was this: how is it possible that thousands of policy people who individually lack power can collectively condition the movements and life chances of millions of migrants? In addressing this question, I didn't want to get caught up in the ever-changing shape of migration management, how does one crisis or another affect things, but rather that we stay focused on the underlying conditions that makes any shape it takes possible. What renders an enfranchised European policymaker powerless to act on his or her own better judgments? The answer, I maintain, is an isolation effect that works upon that individual. Don't be fooled, it doesn't isolate people spatially. There's much cooperation going on. Isolation precludes, and here I'm going to get a little philosophical, so I hope you're into this kind of thing, but this is the way to end it. Isolation precludes any individual from manifesting his own or her own judgment onto a situation through speech or action. Isolation, in other words, denies difference, a constituent and public appearance. It manifests itself in several ways. First, the sheer volume and ubiquity of high-scale morality that I mentioned earlier makes it nearly impossible to present a seriously alternative perspective. This, in turn, greatly reduces the range of options that different people are well capable of making or imagining. If difference is removed from public debate, then each person is structurally isolated as a particular speaking subject. And each person, in fact, is that because no two people have lived the same life. You have a particular view. You gain presence, then, only by repeating high-scale morality, but ironically, such recognition only comes at the cost of your particular voice. Second, the use of algorithmic technologies, which happens in many more cases than just biometrics, but that's the easiest one to think about, devalues the technician or the official deploying them. But these technologies do more than render that technician superfluous because they perform the mind's logical operations more efficiently. Everyone knows that point. Rather, they ultimately rob the technician of his or her thinking capacity. And I want to make a distinction between logic and thinking. Logic gives us certainty, or at least high probability, but only in the realm of abstract reason. Pythagorean's theorem is always true, but that's all abstract. It does not give us certainty in the messiness of the actual world itself. Hence, logic cannot provide the ethical guidance we need to navigate that world. Why? Because ethics requires thinking. When we think about an ethical dilemma, we undertake the two-in-one dialogue with ourselves, prompted by our visceral encounters with that messy world. We are examining, when we think, the standpoints of others, those who are different and we never expected to meet. And we are trying to reach inner agreement with ourselves through that thinking dialogue about how we can live with those people. If we can't reach inner agreement through that dialogue, we cannot accept how we ourselves are a part of a world that we find disagreeable. We therefore would feel compelled, doesn't mean that we will, but we will feel compelled to act, to try to change that world. So deny people the chance to voice their thoughts, and you also preclude their capacity to act with others on the basis of their unique standpoints. You will deny their originality and their capacity to inaugurate a new beginning. And that's what action par excellence is. It's a new beginning. Okay, third, and a function of that, the entire work experiences of those in the migration apparatus, with the possible exception of police investigators and asylum interviewers, is kept separate from the lives of migrants. The latter are only recognized in quantitative form, not as persons with qualitatively unique lives who can speak as equals from their own standpoint. And this is precisely the dilemma that Maria was negotiating. Hence, no one with policy authority need confront those whose lives they manage. They need not reconcile themselves to difference. That is, they need not think. And I don't mean don't be logical. They don't have that. They're not compelled to have the two-in-one dialogue. This, in turn, isolates that individual because everywhere one turns, everyone else is doing the same thing. So you're surrounded by sameness. These three effects of isolation disempower a policy player. Rather, he is isolated or she is isolated because, as I just said, you're surrounded by sameness in every direction. This systematic absence of difference certainly makes life safe, or it makes you think that it's safe. However, isolation undermines action if action means the direct constitution with others of a world that we actually want. Regardless of the constantly changing shape of European migration management, these features endure, and they deeply structure the ethical actions that anyone would have to take who dares to think differently. I make this point not to instigate some kind of rebellion in the world of migration policy, though I might entertain the prospect if it came up. But at a much more mundane level, I only wish to open up a space where people with policy authority can ask themselves the same question that Maria and Ricardo did, a simple question. Am I constructing and living in a world in a way that I can also live with myself? Thank you.
Okay, Greg, thank you very much for this very rich and inspiring talk. I think we're a little bit running late, but still I would like to give the opportunity like 5 to 10 minutes for questions and comments. Loud. Please stand up.
Okay. I would like to know if you think that this isolation effect is specific to a migration apparatus, or do you link it to other kind of apparatuses in the neoliberal setting?
The latter definitely. It's not just migration. It's basically forms of population management, right, in mass society. So, definitely the latter.
First of all, thanks a lot for this really, really inspiring thought. As a matter of fact, we were discussing last night with Simon Prodolier a lot about the topic you mentioned. Some policy officials that we know as liberal thinking people and that we are surprised to see how they react non-critically once they are within the migration governance institutions. I find your analogy of migration apparatus very useful to understand a lot of governance migration. I understand your question of how that apparatus works to make people docile, and you explain a lot of the mechanisms. That's very interesting. And my question is, I'm not sure if this is a too academic question, but if we use the analogy of an apparatus, and we understand how that apparatus makes people docile, how does the apparatus then get programmed? How does the apparatus get programmed or becomes a direction that then makes people docile to act in that direction? I'm not sure if this is clear to you, but you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I see this analogy of the mechanics
Yeah.
of making people docile, but the machine itself, the apparatus itself, how does it get its program, its orientation?
If I understood the question correctly, I think it takes so easily because it's so convenient, right? You just have to look at this beautiful eye map with these pretty colors and you understand the world. And I mean, you think you understand the world. It's convenience. It's the one thing, technology in particular is so convenient to use, just use it, just deploy it. It's so easy to repeat cliches like a migration policy that works for everybody. You don't have to think twice. It's just simple. It's comfortable. I mean, that's how these things kind of grow, right? Even if you know against your own better judgment that it's not that clear, or not that simple, they're still simple to use, right? It makes it easy. That's the main thing. And the other one is if you want to rise up in any career, you have to start conforming, basically. And there's actually interesting observations I had on that front, too, but we'll talk about that later. about who rises in these regimes. Yeah.
I see this analogy working on so many different levels. When you look at society, if you look at the way the education system is constructed, if you look at various apparatuses or apparati, I don't know what the plural is, it's everywhere in society, because if you don't conform to a certain mindset or something, then you're out of the system, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, when you're in the system, you're not, it's not like you're docile, but you're just, you're doing your job, right?
Yeah, you're active, but you're also politically passive.
Correct.
You end up, so you're active and passive at the same time.
Actively passive,
Yeah.
you're thinking and not feeling, or your values are your work, or whatever. You transfer so many different things, and everything
Yeah.
kind of just. So I just see it in working on all levels in society. Actually.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's so refreshing to see how stepping back and reflecting the dimensions of these issues and introducing the ethical dimension helps us to understand deeper the processes that we have described. I come much more from the humanitarian aid, and that's a dimension that has not been mentioned here.
Yeah.
And I would like you to perhaps comment on that, because it seems to me that paradoxically, the people who are actually trying to counteract this isolation, in a sense, inevitably replicate it. Because in other words, what I'm saying is that within the humanitarian apparatus, there is a comparable alienation and depersonalization. And paradoxically, the people who are there to help them to counteract that, they repeat it. I would like to hear more about your own reflections on that.
Well, I've heard that raised many times by people who do humanitarian work, and that, on the one hand, saving people, of course, we want to save people who, that's totally, of course, understandable. But everyone that I know who works on these types of operations also realizes that they're basically reinserting people back into a circulation that puts them right back into a disempowered position. And there's, you feel that kind of frustration, at least I put it this way, I sense it most among people who actually do direct humanitarian work.
In other words, all these impersonal elements within this structure exist almost identical in the humanitarian field, about tracking, about information, about all of that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think they do.
Thank you for your talk. It's interesting to hear you talk of these narratives of control and competence, which these border officials and policy officials express. But for me, that also kind of clashes with these great failures of immigration control that we've been seeing recently. And I was wondering whether your respondents, how they put these two kind of realities together, and how that affects their morale and their sense of solidarity, which you mentioned.
Do you mean that despite efforts to perfectly control and condition, people still get in? They find ways to...
Exactly.
Well,
increasing numbers.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to answer that. One, border guards in particular are well aware you can't account for people that you can't see. So there's lots of, everyone knows people sort of find a way around the system if they can. But from an analytical perspective, one thing that has to be borne in mind is that the state, it's never what it's presented itself to be. That is a perfectly self-contained entity stamped on a piece of land that it entirely... the state has never been static. The state has always been multifaceted, porous, in competition and conflict with the forces that it tries to regulate. So it's always a dynamic thing. Which is why a concept like the apparatus is more helpful than a concept like the state, because the apparatus, it shows you the interactions and how it responds to the creativity of the people it's trying to condition. So for all ways that the people figure out how to get around the system, at some point it'll pick up and there'll be some way to try to plug that hole. And then people will figure something else out, and then, it's the cat and mouse. So at least from an analytical point of view, to talk about an apparatus, it shows you the dynamism between control and evasion. You know, how does a policy person, and this could mean a wide range of people, deal with this? I never met anyone of them that felt personally about it. In fact, you know, darn, someone got through. I mean, I've never seen that. What I actually find quite interesting is how much respect, particularly border guards, have for clandestine migrants, because they actually really find them clever, and they can admire their persistence, and they can, in many cases, appreciate the difficulties they confront. I mean, you know, people understand the situations in many cases. They're not ignorant. And the result is often a kind of interesting admiration, even though you're going to send them back, right?
Okay, thank you very much for...
Can we have your paper to read it?
Sure.
Please.
Okay. You can buy my book, and I can even get a cup of coffee out of that, right? I think I still get 10%. It gets me a Starbucks coffee.
Can I offer the people that we go for dinner and discuss this?
Sure.
Okay, then thank you very much for the talk and the discussion. I think Greg Feldman will be here till Sunday, and if you want to continue the discussion, we could do that after conference for dinner. So if you're interested to discuss it, we can continue this. And I think it's important because obviously you're like an ethnographer, and it's about like this very situated practice and ethics, like conditions of being ethical in the migration apparatus. But like one question is like really, when you talk about we're all migrants, it's about this precariousness, and isn't this same structural ethical dilemma not even happening also in science, in research? These are questions which are important, or aren't we all in this situation of being made like being able to be irresponsible, like in this sense of the banality of the evil that I think you allude to, and I think that's a very important question, like in a migrant society to discuss, and it's not about like migrants, but it's also about ourselves. So thank you very much for the talk, and bon appétit.